All right, welcome everybody to today's lecture. This is for Tuesday, although I'm about a day behind. So for this week, we'll have a couple lectures. They'll be relatively short as we're just working through some of the, more or less the content, the concepts in the first few chapters of our clean code book, and just talking about kind of some high-level basic, how can we write code, how can we write code better, some things that are good to think about that I don't think oftentimes get thought about is really being intentional about function names, really being intentional about variable names. Today we're going to talk just for a few minutes about comments, and even comments. I think it's oftentimes very easy to just overlook the importance or the impact they can have on the overall readability, the maintainability of our code. And also too, as we start to think about the comments that we're writing and then using that comment to evaluate the code that we've written, I think it can also help us to make better code. I should have everything graded, so the last lab, the lab that was due on Friday, has been graded. If you have any questions from that, let me know. I think it looks like everybody pretty much understood the concepts that we were trying to work through and get, and so that's great. If you have any feedback for that, if it was too easy or too hard or just about right, let me know. I'd like to know that so that I can help better adjust the assignments, either also for the rest of the course, for the rest of the semester, and then also for future courses that are taught. So you can send those to me if you'd like, or of course we're nearing the end of the semester here. It's not too far off. We'll be doing the student opinion surveys here, and so that'll be another opportunity to do that. I did want to take a look at the pull request just to make sure that everybody does get kind of the point behind it. One of the big things that the pull request allows us is it allows us to discuss code. We can use a tool like GitHub in order to talk about the code, to interact with other developers or somebody else that wants to look at it. And so you can initiate a pull request without really intending the pull request to be closed. You can initiate a pull request just to say, hey, so-and-so, I'd like you to take a look at this. Oftentimes, though, when we initiate a pull request, it's because we're ready to close the work or bring some of the work that we have in our branch into another branch, into the master branch or the development branch or the production branch. It all depends on what model that we're following, what workflow that we're following. In this case, if you take a look at the pull request that I created, I just added another plugin. Okay, again, I'm trivializing the work that we're doing here because we're not going to all set out and write a bunch of code. And so by adding plugins, I'm just trying to simulate that we have something that we actually want, a complete project, a complete something on a branch that we want to add to master. In this case, simply adding a plugin. One of the big things we can't do with this is we can't test. Okay, we didn't go all the way to setting up our WordPress site and actually going in there and testing that the plugins work. Now, we can assume, because with most plugins, if you put them in the proper folder, the plugins folder, they are going to work. So if there was a bug in the code, then it would be a bug in the actual plugin from whoever authored the code and not necessarily our problem. When we do a pull request, another opportunity that this gives us, and I know we've talked about this before, is the opportunity to do a code review. I don't think you can stress how important code reviews can be from a variety of perspectives, from the quality of the code, from the mentoring aspect, from just invoking conversation and getting somebody else's viewpoint on it. The problem with them is that they're, by and large, they can be time consuming, and so it's just easier to skip them. It also depends on the kind of environment. If you have developers on your team, if you yourself are one of them, I guess, that you're very opinionated on how things are done, code reviews can quickly turn into something that become relatively combative or counterproductive. And so as that leader or the mentor on the team, the senior person, really striving to implement an effective and efficient code review process, and one that opens up your team to conversation and to talking and discussing and writing better code, and hopefully catching bugs and everything along the way. So, okay, so here we can see I opened up a pull request, and very similar to what everybody else did. Of course, we have the easy button. You can merge the pull requests, and offhand, I can't remember exactly what commands are called here. If you look, though, you can also see that there's the command line. And so what we can do is, if we wanted to, we could go ahead and this is what we normally want to do, is do this from the command line. What happens if we just push the easy button, click the easy button? Well, it just pulls it right into the master line. And so now it's on master. And so we have to assume that whatever is being requested to be merged works. We didn't necessarily test that out. We're just merging it right to master. One of the benefits of having a branch is that we don't clutter up the master line with commits that we don't actually want or commits that need to be fixed. We want to keep our master line as clean as possible because that's the code that's going to go into production. You know, what if your process is that every time you commit to master that it triggers your build process, right? So we wouldn't probably want to just click the easy button. So we want to go through the process of running this from the command line. You can see here, okay, we're going to fetch from the origin, we're going to check out the branch. Now we're on the branch. We're on the branch that someone wants to merge, and we're going to merge master into the branch. Okay, we want to do this on the branch because if there's any conflicts that are coming from master, now is the time to deal with them. We also want to test. We also want to say, okay, because things could have changed. There could be additional commits on master that I don't have on my branch, in this case, my Stroshine demo branch. And so we want to bring those changes, those commits from the master line into our branch and then test it. Does everything still work? Does what's on master and what's on my branch, does everything still jive? Okay, so now we can test it. And we can test this locally. Okay, we're doing this on our local repository, on our systems, on our development machines. And so if something goes wrong here, it's pretty easy to fix it. It's pretty easy to comment on this pull request and say, nope, this is a bad plugin, this is bad code, I would recommend doing this, this is, change this variable name, whatever it is. We can facilitate the conversation through here, but then it's all local. Okay, then once you're done, okay, check out master. We merge the branch into master. We shouldn't have any issues because we just took care of those on our branch, and then we finally push to origin. Okay, so it's the last thing we do. All of this stuff happens locally. We do it all locally. It's much easier to revert or stop a merge or prevent a commit from going to the master line, from going to the remote, from going to GitHub on our local machine. Okay, so again, we weren't really able to, through the pull request here, we weren't able to necessarily, or at least I didn't come up with a good enough setup for you to actually do the pull request, test the code to make sure it worked, and then pull to, push that to the origin. But that would definitely be the idea, and one of the many benefits of doing that. Okay, if you take a look, okay, so if we use a tool like SourceTree, and you look at the different branches that we had here, you can see. Okay, here's the master line. If we look at the merge for Brent's branch, I believe Alex did that. You can see here we had a merge from master into the line, and then from there we merged back into master. So you can see there the merge came into the line, able to test it on the branch before we finally merged back in. Okay, so that's just an example. That's how you can see that a little more visually or graphically there. Okay, additionally, and I've got this uploaded, there's this another PDF document. It's called Language Study. It's updated in the, not in the slides section, in the reading section of our content section. And so it's a large-scale study of programming language and code quality in GitHub. So it's just a relatively short academic document, about 11 pages, so there's probably about 9 pages readable. And it just talks about choosing programming languages, some of the issues or I guess things we deal with when we choose languages, and what those choices have on the overall quality of code. So this will be a reading assignment here. Part of the reason we'll have a slightly shorter lecture is just so you have time to read this and additionally work on the project. So check this out. It's again in detail in the content section, and read through that, and then we'll maybe discuss it later this week or next. No lab this week, or at least I'm not anticipating it. I will get a lab opened, well, I should say this, between Thursday and early next week, so sometime between Thursday and Friday, and have another lab before Thanksgiving break so that you don't have anything to work on over Thanksgiving break. So that'll be the idea there. Keep in mind then, on Tuesday, next Tuesday is a holiday, so we won't have any lecture on Tuesday, and then we'll pick back up again on Thursday. So you can anticipate only having one video to watch next week. Okay. All right, so the slides open here. I guess as a side story here before we get started, so from the lab, one of the things I asked you to do was create a patch, and I tried to hide it, although probably not all that well, that the patch that you were creating was for an SQL injection vulnerability for Drupal core. So I do a fair amount of Drupal development. It's one of the languages that or frameworks that I'm currently the most fluent in, just because I'm in it the most often. It fluctuates based off of the kind of work I'm doing and who I'm working for, as I still do a variety of freelance contract work. Drupal is a content management framework. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Drupal, it's very similar to a WordPress. Okay, it gives you the ability to take a bunch of code that's been written by somebody else. It's all open source. It's well maintained, and then set up a website that has a lot of basic functionality. Creating users, posting content, creating pages, a whole variety of things, forms, and then just like WordPress has a bunch of plugins. Drupal has a series of modules, so you can extend the functionality. You can write your own code. You can create your own custom modules or plugins for the framework. There is a team then that's dedicated to fielding essentially bug requests. So it's an open source project, and so if you look at how would I, let's say I want to be a security researcher and I want us to do security research on the Drupal framework. Well, it's an open source framework, and so if I find a security vulnerability in the framework, then Drupal has, let's see if I can find it real quick. How to report a security issue, yep. Okay, so they have a process for how you can report security issues with Drupal core or contrib. Now contribs are just modules. That's the code that somebody else has written. Core is the framework. Core is like that WordPress bundle or software that we downloaded. So they have a process. They have a process for you to say, okay, I want to do the research, I find a bug. Maybe I'm just doing some development, I'm digging through the code and I find a bug, I find a flaw, and you can responsibly disclose it. You can send it to Drupal. Drupal will verify it, they'll vet it, and the team will, and then they'll say, yep, no kidding, this is a problem. We're going to create a patch for it. We're going to get the patch in place, and then we'll let the world know, which is where you get announcements like this. SA Core 2014-005. So they follow a very similar format to our CVEs. And in fact, they oftentimes issue a CVE in conjunction with the notification from Drupal. And that is, now it's public. It's public, everybody knows about it, so if you didn't know about it, now you know about it, and you need to get that patched immediately. And oftentimes you'll see that let's see here, where does it say that? Solution, install the latest version. So upgrade Drupal to this version, 7.32 in this case. If you can't do that, in this case they created a patch. Okay, so your patches should have looked very similar to the one that's generated here. And that is, you can see it's a very simple fix. Remove this line, add this line. Okay, change the way that this function is handling those parameters for its prepared statement. Okay, with other platforms you can do security research, but it's a lot harder. Okay, Twitter, Google, Facebook, they have programs. You can look into programs if you want to do security research. You have to do it though in a somewhat controlled and then definitely in an ethical way. So with this one then, okay, this is an SQL injection vulnerability. If you look at some of the top application security flaws, SQL injection is going to be one of those top ones. And this one was a big deal. In fact, let me see if I can pull this up real quick. Public service announcement. Okay, so then after the fact, after they published that, I'm going to go back and see when that was published. Looks like October 15th. They came back, and on October 29th, they had this PSA come out. And what this PSA said was, websites, you should proceed under the assumption that every Drupal 7 website was compromised unless updated or patched before October 15th, 11 p.m. UTC. That is 7 hours after the announcement. Okay, so you really had to be on the ball here to keep your site up to date. That's a pretty impactful statement to say if you didn't patch this thing within 7 hours, you should assume your site was compromised, and you should get rid of it. Okay, now there's this process to look at, and how do we fix this? How do we go about and say, well, we patched the site. How do we know if it's secure? And I apologize if I'm just completely gone off on a tangent here, but I think it was worth talking about that since we're talking about software development leadership, if you're running systems like this, whose responsibility is it to keep the Drupal code updated? Well, is it the developers? Is it the system administrators? Is it you as the leader? Is it someone on the team? It needs to be identified. If you're running a framework like this and they produce patches like this to keep it secure, just like your system administrator is going to be keeping your Windows machines up to date, they're going to have a patch management process. Software development needs to follow the same procedures, the same process. Simply updating to Drupal 7.32 will not necessarily remove all backdoors. That patches the vulnerability, but if your site's already been compromised, there may be malicious files living on the server. So I bring this up partially to talk about the fact that I had a client running a version of Drupal, Drupal 7. They were on 7.31, I believe, or maybe even 7.30. I'm not sure now offhand. But we failed to get the patch applied in time, and their site was actually compromised. And so I got an email, a phone call, and a text message, all within about 30 seconds of each other, saying, "Hey, the site's down. Can you come fix it?" And I knew right away that the problem with the site going down was most likely that it actually got hacked, because sites just don't stop working for no reason typically. And I know there was no changes or upgrades to the server, which is the other thing that can cause a site to crash. So after some time, I wasn't quite in the position to work on it. I did finally get a chance to look at it, and it was just throwing up an error page. So you'd go to the site, and you would just see on the page, it's a PHP site. Drupal's written in PHP. It would just say, "Error trying to do this," and the page wouldn't load. And so what do you do at that point? Well, if we know simply updating the site does not remove the backdoor, then we have two pieces that we're concerned about. One is the code, the other is the database. So first thing I do is I have a clean copy, and I actually use Git using Bitbucket, which is it's like GitHub, except that it offers free private repositories, and people have feelings about that. I don't really care. It's free private repositories. That's all I care about. And so I, take a clean snapshot of the code that I know is clean, apply the patch, make sure that this patch has been applied, and now go into the server and delete everything. All the code's got to go. And so what I did was I pulled a backup down. I did run a virus scan on it. I did look through all the files that I could. I did a diff. I actually used a file merge application, did a diff on my new version, my clean version, and the version that I pulled down, and did not find any malicious files. I didn't find any files that actually weren't expected there. So it wasn't the code. They didn't upload anything malicious, although they did use this SQL injection vulnerability to compromise the site. From there, well, it's generating content. Something changed. If it wasn't the files, it's got to be the content. So the attackers then were able to put something into the database that the framework was pulling out and causing it to error. So at that point, you have to figure it's the actual database. So poking around, calling up some specific pages, I was able to eventually look at the users, and the attacker had actually used that injection vulnerability to create 2 administrative level users. So they had admin access to the site at this point. They from there logged in, and because Drupal's a content management system, they started creating content that would show up on the home page that they then, in that content, they embedded their malicious code. The level of sophistication of the attack, maybe it wasn't that great, because what they ultimately ended up doing was embedding code that was causing the error. And so then you'd hit the home page and the site would crash, which then tipped their hand that they were in there doing bad things. In which case, that's the case where I came in. So we had to dump the database, delete it, don't trust it, it's infected, it's malicious, we don't know exactly what happened there for sure. We have bad content for sure, we have bad user accounts, passwords compromised. So delete it, and we need to go to a backup. Well, of course, with this system, the backup that they have running, it's only for 1 day. And there's only a 1-day history. And so that backup that it had already ran. So that was a backup of the site that got hacked. So that backup was no good. So what do we do from there? Well, we had to go to a version that I had from several months prior when I was doing some of the initial development. So the site lost content from the time that I had my backup to kind of the current state of it, because we don't trust the database that was compromised. Now, I think we'll be able to pick through that and pull some content out of it, but it's going to become a very time-consuming and manual process in order to do that. So we eventually got it up and running, and everything is, as far as we can tell, back to normal. But it was painful. It was a painful process, and so Lot of lessons learned there. Keeping systems patched, having a patch management process for your applications, having good backups. Not only code backups, so in this case having good solid version control helps, but also having backups of the database and not just a daily backup. Figure out what is your threshold. What can you afford to lose? Can you lose more than an hour's worth of data? Can you lose more than 6 hours? What about a day? What about a week? And so have a backup strategy that allows you to, if right now everything crashed and disappeared, your database was gone, and you had to roll back to a backup, how far back would you have to go? So some of those things to consider. So if you have any questions on this, please shoot me an email or let me know. I'd love to discuss it more. I do have some of the code, so if you want to look at kind of the anatomy of what happened. I was able to use access logs. So on the server I have error logs. I couldn't get the access logs, so I wasn't able to fully piece together exactly what was sent to the application to compromise it. I did see parts of it through the error log when the attacker started generating errors in the system. Okay, so I'll get back on track here. So let's get this going here. So this is a short chapter to talk about, and again, it's comments. And you think, well, what can you really have to say about comments? What's going on here? But when you stop and think about it, comments are much more important. They can have a very profound impact on the application itself. So I'm going to pick a few pieces out of the chapter that I think are worth talking about. Otherwise, again, I highly encourage you to read through the chapter. It's chapter 4. In the Clean Code book. So the author starts off with some pretty bold statements and saying that don't comment bad code, rewrite it. No, that's not very bold. That's very common sense and practical. He says stuff like, we use comments to compensate for our inability to express ourselves in code. And when you start to think about how we write code, that code should flow, that it should read, that variable names and function names, and it should all kind of read like a story, as we talked about in the last lecture or so, then it lessens our dependencies on comments to actually express ourselves. And so if we do look at our comments as an inability to express ourselves in code, I don't think it seems like maybe such a drastic statement, and that it oftentimes truly is. Now, that's not to say that all comments are bad. There are plenty of very appropriate, very helpful comments, meaningful comments we can put into our applications. But if we start on this premise and we always question the comments that we're putting in, do they really add value to what we're doing here, to the code? Could I rewrite code to make it better? I think it helps us to write better code. Don't comment bad code, rewrite it. That's one of the quotes early in the chapter there. And again, I think that comment or that quote just goes to indicate or to help kind of capture that. Is that if you find yourself going to write a comment, especially a comment where you're about to explain what something does, then stop and think. Can I take that comment and avoid having to write it all together because I could rewrite the code. I could do better names, better variables, better structure organization, and make it completely null and void. They can be very misleading. Comments can, because comments tend to be written at the time that they made sense to the author. So as his time evolves, the author maybe leaves. He doesn't, the people that follow on and maintain that code, they don't understand exactly what the comment meant. Maybe it had a very specific meaning, or maybe it's just been so long that the comment's not there. One of the worst things is a comment that the comments change, or they don't change, but they can lose their position in the code. As a comment's left, it's typically left right above the line of code that it's intended to comment. And as more people maintain that, or even the same author maintains that, more code can get injected between that comment and the line of code that it was supposed to be for. In which case, then you have a comment that no longer is clearly associated with any particular line of code or any particular part of the program, and so it's just not really sure what it's supposed to mean. And then you have developers that maybe, again, they weren't the original authors. They don't really know what it's saying. They know that a lot of other people have looked at this code, so what do they do? What do you do with it? Well, I'm not sure, but I'm not going to be the one that deletes it, so I'm just going to leave it in there. And that happens a lot, and that happens a lot to me, and not just with comments, but also with code. I look at a piece of software, I find code that's been commented out. Doesn't look like the code has any value whatsoever. It looks like it's old code. It needs to go away. It's just cruft in the application, but I'm not sure. And I know that I'm the 15th person that has looked at this code since it was written, because you can go back through the version control. And so I better just leave it. I don't want to be the person that deletes it, because then, but because we use version control, I'll talk about this in a little bit, deleting it isn't the end of the world. You will have a version control system with Git. If we have a commit that shows that we removed this code, we went through, and maybe we just have a cleanup commit. Just all it did was I removed cruft from the application, commented out code that just no longer made sense, or I wasn't really sure. Well, that's still captured in Git. So if at some point in time it becomes critical that that commented out code gets brought back to life, or somebody needs to reference it, then you have the version control system to go back and find that. Here's an example of how comments can lie, and maybe not lie, but they can definitely be misleading. Okay, so this comment, I assume that it was intended to be, and I think the author explains that, it was intended to be a comment above the regular expression, this being a very large regular expression, to parse out a date time format. And so this is two examples here. One is an example of the comment getting pushed away. Somewhere it was supposed to appear somewhere, and somehow it started to shift. It started to drift away from the original code that it was commenting. So it's losing its impact. It's not necessarily lying in this case, but it certainly isn't helping because it's not directly in line with what it's explaining. The second thing, and one where a comment, if maintained in the appropriate position, can be helpful, is that when we read things like a regular expression, regular expressions can be very complicated. If I saw this regular expression and I had no context that it was a date regular expression, especially or particularly an HTTP date regular expression, it would take me some time to figure this out. There would obviously be some clues. We'd have SMTWF, so I'm thinking days of the week. We'd have maybe months. We'd have maybe general amount time. Okay, so or Greenwich Mean Time, I think is what that stands for. General amount. I don't know where I came up with that, but so there'd be some indications. But for me to go through that and figure out exactly what this matches would take a while. And so having a comment above that regular expression that says that this is the format it's matching, Tuesday the 2nd of April 2013, then that would be very helpful. Although in this case, this does seem to lie, because if we look at this regular expression and we look at what this is telling us, this regular expression does not look like it'd be matching to this. So I guess this is a case in which this would be lying, and that this regex does not match what the example is. So it can be very misleading, because I'll look at this comment and I'll say, oh, it matches this, and then I'll completely ignore the regular expression, unless I start running the application and I see, oh, there's bugs, because what I'm sending in is not being matched correctly with this regular expression. There's obviously a problem in it. And then I'd go through and rewrite the comment or delete it altogether. So again, it can be worse if they lie. If they're not telling us the truth, that is, that this is not the format, that this is actually now matching. Inaccurate comments are far worse than no comments at all. And again, I think that last example kind of ties into that, in that it can lead you down bad paths if you have something complex, and so you're depending on the comment that's left behind instead of having to analyze what the code is doing, and the comment is wrong. It can lead you down a bad path. It can make you write bad code, or it can set you with wrong or false assumptions, and then it can just waste time. The truth can always be found in the code, and that is really the underlying. So if we go back to this and I say, well, I'm not really sure, is this really how this regular expression is matching? Well, this is the regular expression. So if I'm not sure, then I need to figure out, and maybe it is, I don't know. I guess it kind of looks like maybe it is the same thing. I'm not sure. I'm not sure without testing it 100%. So the more I look at it here, I didn't really study it before we got into the lecture here, the more it starts to look like, yeah, maybe in fact it is the exact same thing. Either way though, the truth is in the regular expression. If I sat down and studied this, I could know 100% what this regular expression is doing, and then that could verify whether or not the comment is correct. So when in doubt, look at the code, study the code and read it. Okay, here's an example right out of the book. Okay, here's a comment. Check to see if the employee is eligible for full benefits. and then we have this if statement with employee.flags and the hourly flag, and employee.age is greater than 65. And so we have this combination of properties and variables and conditions and a comment to tell us what it's doing. Well, why wouldn't we or couldn't we just write employee.is eligible for full benefits? This is much easier to read. I don't have to understand conditions. I don't have to understand the age is greater than 60. I don't have to understand any of that. And additionally, I don't need the comment above it. I can read this line of code and I know exactly what is going on. So, looking at, again, if I looked at this comment and said, well, is there a way that I could, instead of writing this comment, make this code better? That there probably is. Create a small function off of this class, off of this object, that does this for us. And then name that something very appropriate, just like this. And now this becomes very readable, very easy to maintain versus this first one. Same thing gets accomplished, but this is just much easier to read. Comments can definitely be good. Comments can be necessary. You can have legal comments. Okay, so anybody that's dealt with any sort of software that they didn't write themselves, they're probably open source projects or commercial software that you've purchased. There's probably license information inside the source code, depending on if you were with a commercial product, if you were given access to the source code. Disclaimers, copywriting, licensing, a lot of legal consideration in putting the comments in the code, and a lot of times that is necessary, and a lot of times you will see that. Informative comments, again, those can be very helpful. Informative comments would be like the example of the regular expression. Putting inside there, this is what this regular expression does, as long as the comment doesn't lie. It can be very helpful. Explanation of intent and also for clarification. So with the explanation of intent, again, sometimes it can help, the comment can help if you understand why someone did it the way they did it. I've run into the situation where I'm writing code, and after a bunch of trial and error, I realized that what I'm writing, I can't, maybe it's something that it's a process, or it's something that I typically have done, or I've done very similar in the past. But because of this one system I'm working on, this one program I'm working on, I have to do it a little bit differently. And so leaving a comment to explain, well, I wouldn't normally do it this way, but I'm doing it this way because, not that I can't express myself in code, not because I can't write the code better, but because there is a limitation within the system, or there's a limitation within the requirements, or something. So it's helping to explain why you're doing something. Because if you don't, oftentimes then someone else will come behind you and they'll say, well, it doesn't make sense why they're not doing this, and then they'll try it, and then they'll have to go through this whole period of trial and error themselves, wasting a bunch of time and effort. Clarification, here's an example of clarification, where again we have, if you look at this code, I don't know if you're familiar, it looks like it's a JUnit, which is a unit testing library, so you can write unit tests, and we will do some unit testing here just at the very end of the semester. Here's some comments after each line to help show you what comparison, so it's trying to make better sense. Again, the comments are helpful as long as they're accurate. If any of these comments are wrong, because I can create a comment that is not exactly what is happening in actual code, then they can cause as much damage because they're misleading their line. Intentional or not, they probably wouldn't be intentional, but to-do comments, I think these are worth talking about just simply because you tend to see them a fair amount. To-do comments, there are, oftentimes they're going to be, you can write them in a particular format, whether it's Java or Microsoft or whatever. I see the ampersand to-do in a lot of different like PHP-based applications. And it's just a kind of a note to yourself or to anybody else that comes behind you that there's more work to be done. Now, again, depending on the kind of project, if you have robust project management software, then leaving a bunch of to-dos in your code may or may not be appropriate. It may not be helpful. It's hard to say. With a lot of modern IDEs, though, so if you're doing your development in Eclipse or you're doing it in Visual Studio, they have ways, those IDEs have ways to go through the code and then show you all the to-dos and show you in a nice sub-window within the IDE itself and all those to-dos. You can go through there and you can keep track of them. And so with a modern IDE, it's very easy to leave to-dos behind in the code and keep track of them so that you don't have your code, it doesn't get cluttered up with them, and you don't lose track of them. But we still want to be careful. I mean, we don't want to leave, if we have a function that's only 5 lines long and we have 17 to-dos in it, it adds a lot of cruft. It adds a lot of additional stuff to the application. So, we want to just be careful and leave to-dos that are appropriate and that overall help the development of the software. We want to try to avoid redundant comments and comments that restate the obvious. Okay, and I see a lot of these comments myself. I've probably done a lot of them myself. If you're looking at an object-oriented system here, so we have a class called annual date rule, and the comment here is the default constructor. Well, we know by looking at that that's a default constructor, again assuming that there's an annual date rule class here, and so a comment like that really doesn't do us any good, because anybody that's looking at this code that's working on object-oriented language and working in Java, I think this is all the examples are in Java, you should be able to look at that and see that. So oftentimes comments like that are just unnecessary because they're redundant. Restating the obvious. Okay, private int day of month. The comment above that is the day of the month. Okay, it's a well-named variable. Day of month. The fact that the type is int, we know that the day of the month is going to be an integer value, so it's not going to be a string-based representation. And so having the comment there really doesn't help anything because the variable name itself tells us exactly. And then this last example: returns the day of the month, returns the day of the month. Return day of month. So again, a lot of redundancy here, and so we just want to try to avoid that. We don't I especially see this with some of my early programming classes here that I teach, 150s and 250s. Sometimes people get the impression that more comments are better, that regardless of what you're doing, more comments are better. And generally with entry-level programming courses, I encourage students to leave comments in their code to help them work through what they're doing, to help them work through the application until they get used to or more comfortable with this kind of abstract way of going about working. But as they move into more advanced courses, then the dependency or the urge to leave comments, comments should add to the program and not detract from it. And so they've got to kind of steer away from that. So something as a leader, as a mentor, to help identify, see, and then move everyone in the right direction. Attributions and bylines, and this is something. Okay, so inside of the code ourselves, we start leaving authorship information behind, and I tend to see this with more of the older programmers that I've worked with, people that have been programming maybe 15, 20 years before I started, in which case their tools weren't maybe quite as robust or advanced as what we have today. And so they leave a lot of this authorship information in their code. And again, most of the applications, most of the code we're going to work on is going to be in some sort of source control. The source code itself, so the program, the Java, the C#, as well as the stored procedures. A lot of the SQL can be added to source control as well, so that you can track changes to the schema. You can have scripts to restore to. In this case here's an inset from some code that I worked on with some other people, and it's for a stored procedure. So you're seeing some SQL here, and that's what this person did. They had a tendency to, every time they touched it, they would date it, they would put their initials, and then they would say what they did. Okay, and what do we do when we have a git commit? Okay, it's dated, it's authored, and we have the ability to leave a very verbose message if we want. And so I would say that with most of this, this day and age, it's unnecessary. Source control, version control systems are very good at doing this for us, so that we don't need to do this. This just adds clutter to the code. If I'm really concerned about this commit that was on 10.18, I can go into the version control system and look that up myself. And again, Git's going to allow me to add a much better commit message, and so I can get a much better statement out of that if I'm interested in what happened there. Okay, and that's it. Okay, so that's all I had for slides. Here's an example. I meant to jump into this earlier. This is some actual code that I wrote. Okay, and it's an active site that I'm still maintaining. I go back though, and I wrote this. This was well over a year ago. And so you go into this this application. It's PHP. It's actually for some Drupal stuff. And I see this big hunk of commented out code. And at this point in time, I'm pretty confident that I could delete it and it would have absolutely no impact. But there is a part of me that hesitates. It's like, well, I've hung on to it this long. Maybe there's something in here that's just a critical value that someday I'm gonna have to pull out, and that's really not true. It just causes confusion when I look at this code. So what I really need to do, again, delete it, commit. It could be one single commit. I deleted this code, and I can remove it. I can comment that. I could tag it if I wanted to, so that if I ever do need to go back, I can use Git to show me where I did some code cleanup, and just help to add, increase the readability of this code overall. So. All right, well, that's it. That's all I have today. I'll get another lecture out either tomorrow, which will be Thursday, or Friday, just depending on kind of a day off this week. So this next one might follow a little bit shorter, but we'll just continue talking about moving into kind of chapter 5, 6 in the Clean Code book, and again, maybe having the next lab ready by the end of this week, or maybe early next week. So hope everybody has a good rest of the week here, and I'll talk to you on Thursday, Friday.